Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Good. Thanks so much to Naomi for inviting me and to everyone involved in organizing this exciting symposium. I'd like to start with a provocation. One I don't quite stand behind, but I think a useful conversation starter. Here goes. Numerous early modern states and empires placed Persianate literature at the center of their bids for cultural hegemony in Eurasia, but only one 20th century state did, the Soviet Union. To defend this, the natural starting point would be two events of the mid-30s. Soviet participation in the global millennial celebration of the Persian poet Firdawsi in 1934, and Soviet hosting of the Third International Congress of Iranian Art and Archaeology at the Hermitage in Leningrad in 1935. We'll start with these moments and move outward from there. So, yes. The Jubilee was planned by top Iranian cultural officials under Reza Shah, intended as the apotheosis of newly modern, assertive Iranian nationalism under the sign of the national epic, the Shahnameh, and its poet Firdawsi. Orientalists around the world held their own celebrations, but came to Firdawsi's birthplace of Tus for the unveiling of the poet's new pseudo-pre-Islamic mausoleum, and to Tehran for a World Orientalist Congress. Soviet Orientalists made a strong showing in Tehran, sending the second largest delegation after Iran. Some, like the Georgian-Russian scholar and poet IuriiMarr, gave their speeches in fluent Persian, unlike any of the Western Orientalists. The Armenian scholar Iosif Orbeli, a student of IuriiMarr's more famous father, the linguist IuriiMarr, was director of the Hermitage, and he arranged lavish gifts for the state of Iran, reproductions of pre-Islamic plates, and a facsimile of one of the earliest Shahnameh manuscripts. I've marked them in the group photo, together with the two Iranian counterparts I'll be talking about later, the poet-scholars Mohammad Taqi Bahar and Sa'id Nafisi. In a newspaper report on the Iran Congress, another Soviet Orientalists celebrated the shared victory of Iranian and Soviet scholars over their Western counterparts and urged a formalization of these ties ahead of the Iranian Art Congress the following year to, quote, conclusively prove that the first prize for knowledge of the cultural heritage of Iran belongs unquestionably only to these countries and to them together. He emphasized the role here of Soviet nationalities that had been organically linked to the cultural development of Iran, who made Iranology, quote, not just a matter of exotic curiosity, but a serious task for developing the national cultures of the Soviet Union. Indeed, celebrations of the Firdawsi Jubilee, as they called it in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet republics, emphasized these historic links with exhibits of manuscripts and talks on the reception of the Shahnameh across Eurasia. New literary and dramatic works were produced responding to the Shahnameh in all the Union-level republics. And here is a caricature of Firdawsi's reception by contemporary Azerbaijani poets. Notice that he is a guest, gastiar, but also that the Azerbaijani comrades can entertain him at a chaikhana so everyone feels at home. Okay, so in the month after the Tehran Congress, Moscow and the Soviet republics hosted real Iranian guests for events at which Orientalists, national and Russian writers, and Iranians spoke. The Iranian delegation was led by Sa'id Nafisi, an editor of the latest Shahnameh edition, and his arrival and departure was mediated by events in Transcaucasia, as you can see. 1934 was a high point in Soviet-Pahlavi relations, and Soviet coverage connected the Jubilee with the epic of modernization, not only in the Soviet East, but also in Iran. The party took an interest. Top Politburo member Orjonakidze chaired the organizing committee, and several others, mostly of Caucasian background, spoke at events and met with Iranian visitors. It should also be said that the Jubilee was a major event in the making of Soviet multinational literature. It framed the first Writers' Congress before and after, and set the model for the many Writers' Jubilees that would follow. It came before the Pushkin Jubilee, before any of the Soviet Jubilees. It also spurred a round of translations and publications of classical Persian literature. Here are the Oriental classics published by the main Soviet prestige world literature press, Academia, and we can see that Iranian literature, so-called, dominates. And I'll skip that for now. The Congress was held at the Hermitage, presided over by Orbeli, who held an enormous public exhibition drawing on Russian imperial collections and the Soviet republics, and celebrated in the papers. To get a sense of the story that the exhibition told, let's hear from two attendees. The great critic Viktor Shklovsky later recalled a procession of, quote, vast, multi-millennial, uninterrupted, beautiful art. And to further emphasize the cross-continental continuity, he imagined the journeys of certain patterns, from dishes to other crafts and to poetry, into textiles, in short, through everyday life, byt, which is a key Russian avant-garde term. The exhibit certainly took a maximalist view, including even the Hermitage's items from Scythian burial mounds. And we can see the extent to which Soviet scholars shared in the 30s all-European obsession with the life and death of civilizations from a review by the Polish emigre who served as the Congress's secretary. Quote, in spite of the absorption of Chinese art, in spite of the Mesopotamian influences, the immense voyage that we made at the Leningrad exhibition from Siberia across Turkestan and the Caspian Sea to Iran itself was the triumph of Iranian artistic creation. Iran, including a vast Iran extérieur, which we can think of as Iran Zamin or Iran Shah, forged diverse cultural elements into a world aesthetic. This is not the picture we usually get of the Stalinist culture-building project for the East. After all, the 1930s was when Stalin's formulation, national informed socialist in content, became policy. In practical terms, this meant that insistence on the nation in the cultural realm compensated for the absence of national political sovereignty. The Soviet national cultures were built on analogies and isomorphisms, on maximally interchangeable parts for display at festivals of national culture in Moscow. That is, they were modular, as Benedict Anderson uses the term. In the Soviet case, not only was this modularity maximally self-conscious, but modularity was the point. Often this meant the erasure or partitioning of cultural heritage that blurred the lines between national cultures. In the case of Persianate touchstones, the inheritance battles were often heated. A source of particular tension was the claim that the Persian poet Nezami from Ganje in Azerbaijan was ethnically a Turk and perhaps even wrote in Turkic. I would say that although this partitioning tendency existed in the 30s, it was only in the post-war years that it became a primary concern for the guardians of national cultures. And to some degree, scholars have projected post-Stalinist nationalities discourse onto a period when the state was still purging bourgeois nationalists. And yeah, well, I can say more about that. But at all times, the unity of Persianate literature could be presented as a proto-friendship of nations, as in IuriiMarr's 1935 volume celebrating a medieval Caucasian literary movement, including the Persian Haqqani, the Azerbaijani Nezami, and the Georgian Rustaveli. But between 1935 and 1946, the principle of mutually exclusive modular nations entered the Persianate space in two starkly material ways. First, in the pre-war purges, almost all the many Iranian leftists living in the Soviet Union were murdered. And second, in the final days of the Soviet wartime occupation of northern Iran, after the end of the war, Iranian, Azerbaijani, and Kurdish leftists, with an uncertain amount of Soviet support, attempted either to establish ethnic regional autonomy on the Soviet Republic model or to secede from Iran. These things are still a matter of debate. Only to be crushed in late 1946 after Soviet troops withdrew. The Soviet alternation between cultural entanglement and disentanglement can be seen in a 1947 agitational documentary about the failed Iranian Azerbaijan People's Government, which was produced for Soviet Azerbaijan under the Russian director Esfir Shub. Ardabil, says the narrator, was the hometown of Shah Ismail, the Turkmen Sufi who forced the feudal lords of Iran and Azerbaijan to unite, won a war against the Turk army, meaning the Ottomans, and at the age of 15 became the Shah of Azerbaijan and Iran. During his rule, for the first time, very important decrees were written in Azerbaijan Dili, in the Azerbaijani language. The film goes on to highlight old and new depictions of scenes from Nezami and Firdawsi both. Even the most particularist claim is drawn back to the literary image of the unifying King of Kings. So, I've asked what transnational Persianate culture meant to Soviet culture makers. The question can only be answered together with another. What did Soviet championing of transnational Persianate culture mean to Iranian nationalist culture makers? During the Soviet occupation, almost the entire Iranian modernization-oriented intelligentsia developed Soviet sympathies, and many traveled to Transcaucasia, Central Asia, or Moscow on official junkets. Writers and functionaries of all orientations eagerly attended the Iranian Writers' Congress, organized in 1946 by the Society for Iranian-Soviet Cultural Relations on Soviet Models, and attended by Soviet representatives. In an excellent recent article on Iranian visitors to Central Asia, James Pickett has given a partial explanation. Quote, "The Soviet and Iranian leftist visions of modernity overlapped more than they diverged, and Iranian intellectuals found ample room to pursue their cultural reform projects. I would replace leftist with modernizing. Many Iranians who praised the Soviet project in this period had no interest in land reform or statist economy planning, just industrialization and literacy." But the case of Iranian-Soviet cultural diplomacy in Transcaucasia allows us to see what hopes were held out for transnational Persianate culture, even when the political stakes were higher. On the Soviet side, one crucial sleight of hand is the identification of a wide range of phenomena with Persian culture, and even with Iran, that more properly belong to a zone of multi-directional exchange over eons between several elite prestige cultures and many local cultural nodes. We can understand this occasional Soviet adoption of an Iranian nationalist framing in a few ways, as part of the political overreaction to the specter of pan-Turkism, or as an imperial phenomenon of identification with previous hegemonic cultures, much as the British used Persian or Sanskrit culture in India. These both have some explanatory power, but I'd like to add another approach. In understanding Soviet multiculturalism, modularity is important, but another consideration is what I would call scalability. Scalability is the internationalist ghost in the Stalinist nation-building machine, an aspiration to build a transcendent world culture that is more often associated with the Soviet avant-garde 20s. When we think of Soviet cultural internationalism after the avant-garde, we have in mind modernization as westernization, or especially after the late 30s, Russification, making the Soviet multinational masses cultured by means of Shakespeare and Pushkin. But Persian is another special case. It operates modularly in nations, in the Tajik SSR and in the intermittently semi-colonial near abroad, first Iran and later Afghanistan. It scales up to a cultural commons for a broader Persianate East, both inside the Soviet Union, as we've seen in Transcaucasia and Central Asia, and especially in the 50s and 60s in South Asia. By the way, the clearest sequel to the Firdawsi Jubilee is the Amir Khusro Jubilee in Lahore in 1975. And number three, before the world, the Goethean prestige of Persian poetry makes the Soviet Union a scale model of world literature in one country. So let's keep these two functions, modularity and scalability, in mind as we turn to the Iranians, who appreciated, above all, the Soviet approach to Persian culture. Foremost among these is Sa'id Nafisi, who went on from his mid-30s Soviet lecture tours to become in the mid-40s the secretary of the Society for Iranian-Soviet Cultural Relations and the editor of that society's journal, New Iran, Iran No, all without ever being much of a leftist. In fact, it was his lack of communist sympathies and connections that led to his adoption by both sides as a cultural ambassador. As a literary scholar, he had become friends first with Konstantin Chaikin, an Orientalist then serving as the Soviet embassy's translator, and then with other Soviet Orientalists visiting Iran for research, including IuriiMarr. He was already involved with culture building as secretary of the Pahlavi state-sponsored Iranian Literary Society, so he was able to introduce Soviet visitors to Iranian cultural officials and major writers such as the poet Mohammad Taqi Bahar. When the Soviet Academy of Sciences invited the Iranian Literature Society to send a representative to their bicentenary in 1924, they chose Nafisi, but the Iranian Foreign Ministry withheld permission. When the Firdawsi Jubilee came, the Soviet embassy specifically invited Nafisi to participate, and this time he was allowed to go. Nafisi's later memoirs of that first visit contain a certain amount of sliding scale, Greater Iran irredentism. Georgian food indicates a past connection, But Armenians are closer to Iran to such an extent that you'd say that this land was still a corner of Iran, while Baku, present tense, has a total connection to Iran. All the aspects of life are Iranian. This is a nationalist script, but one echoed by Soviet functionaries. Where Nafisi departs from the script is where the language of shared connections slides into identification of local color as Iranian. But even for Nafisi, the Soviet multinational space reorients Persian or Iranian culture. His recollection of his first speech at the Bolshoi Theater captures the movement from one scale to another. Quote, "Until that day, I had never heard my own voice through an amplifier. While the first sentence in Persian came out of my mouth and my voice reverberated in that huge space in the presence of all those men and women under the high vault of the theater, I entered a state that is difficult for me to express. The translator translated my speech sentence by sentence. Obviously, my speech was about the greatness of Firdawsi's place in the world, the importance of his epic in world literature, and for relations between Iran and the peoples of the Soviet Union. Every time I spoke a sentence that excited their sentiments, the sound of the attendees' applause resounded through that vast space and filled me with such rapture I can't say. The vault, the amplification technology, the translation, the applause, Soviet scale offered Iranian nationalists a place in world culture to fulfill their most chauvinist fantasies. The Soviet withdrawal from Iran was followed in Stalin's last years by a brief backlash against what came to be called, in the context of the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, pan-Iranism. At plenums and in the newspapers, the Tajik scholar functionary Babajan Ghafurov, the Orientalist Lucian Klimovich, and the Tajik poet Mirza Tursunzadeh attacked the, quote, false theory of the so-called single literary heritage of the Iranian peoples, and claimed Firdawsi and Ibn Sina for the Tajiks alone. But even then, Tursunzadeh couldn't resist the urge to declare that since the Iranian bourgeois press does not appreciate the classics, it is up to the Tajiks to lovingly and carefully preserve the works of the Iranian poets Sa'di and Hafez in trust and return them to the Persians only when they are ready to be responsible stewards. So in considering cultural union, the Iranian poet Bahar had his own mix of hopes and anxieties. In general, he shared in the 1940s Iranian intelligentsia's Soviet mania, and together with Nafisi and other leading writers and scholars, he traveled to Baku in May 1945 to celebrate Soviet Azerbaijan's 25th birthday and watch plays and operas about Nizami, Shah Ismail, and the Iranian constitutional revolution, of which he had been a major literary hero himself. He was troubled by some inaccuracies in the plays and impressed by their lavish sets and artful Western orchestral arrangements of classical Persian meters and melodies. During their visit, Germany surrendered, and the delegation duly sent a telegram of congratulations to Stalin. The Soviets still occupied Iran. The revolt across the border had not yet started. In Iran, as in the Soviet republics, culture compensated in the absence of sovereignty. Bahar produced a panegyric qasida to Soviet Baku during his visit, printed in Nafisi's journal after their return. And we can see a quote from it here. In it, he stresses common origins and hyperbolically praises the life enjoyed by Soviet citizens. In fact, this part is strikingly similar to contemporaneous Tajik Stalinist verse, perhaps suggesting the parallel evolution or coalescence of authoritarian modernist aesthetics in mid-century Eurasia. No hunger, joyful labor. And in fact, we see some of the same things in Bahar's poems for the Pahlavi state, which were produced under some duress. But he ends the poem by underlining a Persianate frame of reference, but perhaps not common interests. I mean, and this is the ending of it, which amazingly was printed in the Soviet-Iranian Friendship Journal. It ends with a hemistich quoted from a famous poem by Anvari, lamenting the ravaging of Khorasan by Central Asian Turks. And I will close with the end of this poem, alternately delicate and brutal about the common space between guests and hosts. Man zaban vatan khisham و دانم به یقین با زبان است دل مردم ایران همسر. آنچه آرم به زبان راز دل ایران است، بو که اندر دل یاران کند این راز اثر. کی فراموش کند شوروی نیک نهاد، که شد ایران پل پیروزی او سر تا سر. گشت ما را ستخوان خورد که سالی 3-4 چرخ پیروزی بر سینه ما داشت گذر. اینک از دوستی متفقین آن خواهیم که بخواهد پسری خسته و نالان ز پدر. باشد این هدیه باکو اثر کلک بهار، یادگاری که بماند به جهان تا محشر. هست از آن گونه که استاد ابیوردی گفت، به سمرقند اگر بگذری ای باد سحر. Thank you.